And we stay with it. We speak now to Professor Patrick Bond, political economist at the University of Johannesburg. Prof, good evening to you and thank you so much for your time. We are, of course, listening to some of the reporters who are talking about polling, the margin of error, but also at the same time, you then listen to other analysts who are saying that the polls may not be as accurate as a lot of people would like them to be. What's your take?
Yes, the polls have been chaotic, and the momentum that you heard Kamala Harris talking about did go her way, but then there are some major problems coming up because the polls tend to underestimate Donald Trump. And I suspect that it may be particularly in the key state, Michigan, where you saw the rally where Kamala Harris was saying to a very enthusiastic crowd that she'll really sort out the Israel genocide of Palestinians. And yet there are about 300,000 people of Arab American ethnicity, some direct, many Lebanese, and they're really not very comfortable with that. They would obviously know that Donald Trump banned Muslims, or that Trump would encourage Netanyahu to get over with more quickly. So there's no sense really that Trump would be kinder to Palestinians. He uses the term Palestinian as an insult, for example, debating Joe Biden. But that might be the exact site where polling would be crucial to, let's say, asking really, are those voters going to go out and vote for Trump? And will they stay away from Harris? Because really the facilitation of the genocide by the U.S. government under Biden, but also Harris, is for many a red line. The other big state, Pennsylvania. And if you put those two together and Harris wins, she should win the 270 votes necessary. But it's very much up in the air.
And it's up in the air, as some are saying. But when you look at the issue of immigration, Prof, would you say that both candidates dealt with it adequately? Because when one looks at some of the interviews that they would have had, or even the rallies addressing this particular issue, there does seem to be some holes somewhat.
Well, there's obviously a sort of xenophobia that is playing to the economic insecurity, just as we suffer in South Africa. But there's maybe a sort of a scenario in which, if Trump does come to power, particularly with his main advisor on this issue, Stephen Miller, they would do the greatest, let's say, mass eviction of people in U.S. history. There are many people sort of on a relatively gray area between being permanent residents or being, green card and having some permanence and being illegal. So the U.S. economy is dependent upon a cheap labor supply, especially in the service sector and in agricultural, seasonal employment. And I think it would be a big disaster, especially in a place like California, if they did do that. And there would be many business people opposed because they need that inexpensive labor. But the sense from, let's say, average, especially white male voters, is that Mexicans coming over the border, Haitians coming from the poorest country in the hemisphere, are a threat. And you heard Donald Trump say they're eating your dogs. They're eating, just nonsense, sort of rumor mongering. And that's, in a sense, how just desperately poor the rhetoric and the reality of immigration in the United States has become.
When you look at the issues that both candidates are talking about in their campaign rallies, they talk about immigration, they talk about the economy, they talk about what's taking place, the conflict in the Middle East, the war in Ukraine. But what is an average American seized with right now in terms of the issues they're grappling?
Well, they're being asked this question that people in the States are always asked: are you better off today than 4 years ago? And typically with the working class under pressure because of the changes in the economy, the automation, the difficulty especially of getting relatively affordable housing. There'd been an inflation surge under Biden's rule. There is probably a sort of sense by most average Americans that they're not better off economically. But that means whether they really value democracy, because Trump has made pretty clear that if he loses, he has a surprise. And the surprise, like January 6th, I don't know anyone who really anticipated that degree of extreme, let's say, anti-democratic behavior when maybe 40, 50,000 that Trump had gathered in Washington stormed the Capitol. The crucial thing is to save their democracy, one that's very flawed because it doesn't rely on a popular vote. there's an electoral college. What we can anticipate is the far right really being mobilized to try to prevent states, especially those swing states, from certifying their electors. And I suspect by December 11, we'll know. The surprise that Trump and his main ally in the Congress, the Speaker of the House, a Republican, a conservative from Louisiana, Mike Johnson, that they are basically planning, it's been pretty clear, is to not let those states certify the electors in time, and then the House of Representatives, controlled by the Republicans, could do some, quite, let's say, destructive, basically saying this election, we're going to have to just decide it in those states that have voted, and those would probably be leaning towards Trump. If that's the way the plan works out, by December 11, if there's delay after delay, as there was in the year 2000 when Al Gore was defeated because of the Florida vote counting controversies by George W. Bush, it may well be that Trump, losing the popular vote, maybe even losing the Electoral College, might still find a way to win. And that's the extent, I think, to which Americans have to wake up, that their democracy is truly under threat.
Interesting times ahead as I listen to you there. But there is something else that I'm keen to hear your thoughts on, the tones of these campaigns, because you then hear some really unsavory remarks being made in some of these campaign rallies. You see, hear of words like garbage, words like dogs, words like, a whole lot being thrown around when it comes to the campaign rallies. What would you describe as the tone of both these campaigns in the lead up to this election?
Well, in that sense, Bongiwa, of mobilizing the base and getting the supporters, especially of Trump, to show up, these extreme insults against Kamala Harris, against Tim Walz, her running mate, a sort of average guy from Minnesota, the governor there, have become extraordinary. Now, on the other side, Harris and especially Walz have said the problem about both Donald Trump and his running mate, J.D. Vance, is that they're weird. And so there's been this sort of exchange of relatively primitive, childish insults. And I suspect that's going to continue in the days right after the election, with the tone now shifting to you stole the election. And in the case of Harris potentially losing, she may do as Hillary Clinton did in 2016, just gracefully exit the stage. But there'll be a lot of people very, very fearful of what a Trump presidency might mean. And so we'll see probably enormous tensions. It's probably no exaggeration to say that there's a genuine risk in the United States of a civil war, because these are candidates who are just so stuck, and with about 50% of the population favoring each, and with, as you say, the degeneration of rhetoric into a mad populism that means any kind of reconciliation is going to be very difficult.
And I wonder then, Prof, what does it mean for the tone of the administration should whoever wins decide to win this election, as the voters will decide in the coming days? So certainly a lot to watch, as you say, when it comes to this democracy. But thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. Appreciate them. That was Professor Patrick Bond, a political economist at the University of Johannesburg.